Hello, everyone. I'm Ralph, a software engineer here at Genesys, and I would like to share in this DevDrop how to use Amazon API Gateway to invoke Genesys Cloud APIs. And this is part 5, REST API with non-proxy integration. So in the previous video, I have shown you how to configure the API Gateway with REST API with the proxy integration, and the proxy integration is just similar to the HTTP API, where you just have the features of the REST API. So in this part, we'll be uh, discussing on how to configure REST API with the non-proxy integration, where it utilizes the flexibility of the REST API features, like request validation, request parameter transformation, request body transformation, and etc. So let's go back to the AWS console and stay here at the REST API that we created in the last video, which is the Genesys REST API test. The benefit of the REST API is that you can have both proxy and non-proxy integration at the same API. So for the non-proxy integration, uh, let's create a resource. And in this resource, let's say we want to access a particular Genesys Cloud API endpoint. Let's use the users endpoint, since that's what we're using from the previous parts of the video. So we want to customize the get users endpoint using the API gateway. So let's stick to the base resource path and let's add the users resource. So once created, um, let's create a method for that endpoint. And let's set it as get. And since we'll be calling the HTTP or the get users endpoint from the Genesys Cloud API, we'll be using the HTTP integration type. We won't be taking the proxy integration um, since we won't be using that in non-proxy integration. So let's define the endpoint that we'll be calling on this endpoint of the API gateway. So let's set it as get. Then let's enter the get users endpoint. API slash v2 slash users. So we won't be adding any like open and close bracket proxy, since we just wanted to call the users list. And then for the domain, just change this to whatever is much more appropriate in your region. But for this demonstration, we'll be using this one. So we'll be passing the content as pass through. Then let's just leave the integration timeout as is. So as you can see here, since this is a non-proxy integration, we have an additional setting here, which is the method request settings, where you can set the authorization, the request validation. Since we haven't set anything, the default here, or the only option here is the IAM. And then for the request validation, you can validate the body or the body query strings parameters and headers, or just the query string parameters and headers. But for this demonstration, we'll just leave it as is. You can also set here if you want to require an API key for this method. And you can also name the operation actually. So let's just leave this as is. And we want to define some query string parameters. Since with the API slash v2 slash users, we can, there are some optional query string parameters. And there are two things I would like to add, which is the page size and the page number. And in this one, you can set some query string parameters to be required, and you can also set them if you want them to be cached or not. But let's leave this as an optional thing. As for the HTTP request headers, since with the Genesys Cloud API, we need the authorization header. So let's define it as required also for this method. And for the request body, you can also set this up if you need to input some body. You can add some models, and you can define the models in the REST API gateway menu. Since we won't be needing this, let's just remove this one. And yeah, make sure that everything is correct. And once you're done checking, you can just create the method. So once that we have created the method, we have to ensure that on the integration request tab, we also have to configure this one. Since once we have just set up on what the API gateway expects to receive from calling this endpoint with the get method. And now we want to configure what the API gateway does after being called by this. So we have to connect the integration or what to do when calling this endpoint. So let's go. You just go to the integration request tab and we'll edit it. So as you can see, it's just the same settings that you have set before. We just have to add the things that will be passing. So there's a different settings here. This is where you're gonna set on what are the path parameters or the query string parameters or the request headers parameters that you'll be passing when the API gateways is gonna call the endpoint that you've been inputted. So since we have set the query string parameters and the request headers, let's add first the query string. So as you can see here, you have to set the name and also the value. You can set a fixed value, or you can also map the request that you got from the API gateway. So let's say the page number, and we want to get it uh, from the query string parameter that we receive from the client. So in order to get that, so let's just add the method dot request dot, since it's a query string, so it's query string, then the parameter, which is page number. There's also an option to cache it if you want, but we won't be doing that. And then also let's add the page number. No, the page size, sorry. And we can also map it the same as the page size like this. But in order for me to prove that, you can also modify it and set it as any value that you want, or you want this fixed value. Let's set it to like 5 pages only. And lastly, the authorization header. And let's just also map this from the header that we set or defined from the method request, and which is method.request.header.authorization. So that's it. You can also map the templates or the body, which we won't be needing. And also the path parameters, you can also add a path parameter for this. But for now, let's stick to what we set on the method request. And let's save it. And then you can also modify the integration response or the response that you'll be getting from the integration that you set. So for example, once the API gateway with this resource of the get method calls the integration that you input, what will the API gateway do after receiving the response? So you can create a response, but for now, you won't be editing it. And it's here that you can also map the templates, but we won't be doing that for this demonstration. You can also modify the method responses. So you can create like the HTTP responses modify, or you can pass through any data that you want. And of course, you can also test it here. So let's try and test it. Let's say we want the page number to be, so it has a format of like this one. So let's say page number is equals to 2. And also the authorization header since it is required. There is a note here that the API gateway skips authorization. It skips the authorization that you have or that you have set in the API gateway, and we'll just go directly to the integration that you have set. So for this one, we still need to input the authorization, which is, I think, let's just copy it from here. And paste this one. So can also add some client certificates if you generated one and can test it. So as you can see, there's a response. And since there is a fixed page size that we did on the integration request, here at the end, you can see that the page size is 5. And it receives the query strings of the page number 2. So it just shows that our setup of this resource works properly. So we can just deploy it with the test stage. Let's deploy it. So again, if we didn't deploy the API, our user's resource wouldn't work, and and it wouldn't take effect on this test stage. So since we have deployed it, we can test it in Postman actually. So since we have our separate already, let's remove the API v2 users and just add users. And let's say we want to leave, or let's not include a query params. And the effect of this is that, again, the page size is set to 5 because of the settings that we did in the API gateway. So the page number will automatically be 1 for this, and the page size to be 5. So let's send it. So as you can see here, the request is successful. And you can see that the page size is 5 and the page number is 1. And when you compare it to the last one that we did, because the default of this one is 25, page size is 25, and the page number is 1. So we can also do it here. So page size, set it to 5, and the page number is 2, which will also yield the same result that we did on the test. When we try to change the um, the query params of the page size to any number, let's say 10, it's likely that this won't be passed through because we said in the resource or in the integration response that, or in the integration request, that the page size is fixed to 5. So whatever that the client is being passed here, it wouldn't be mapped by the API gateway to be called in the Genesys Cloud API. So let's try to send this one. As you can see that the page on this response, the page size is still 5. So whatever you're gonna pass to this, it would just be disregarded by the API gateway since we didn't map the request by the method request. We didn't map this one to the integration request. So that's how powerful the REST API gateway is, particularly with the non-proxy. So you can manipulate the request that you're receiving from the client, process it, manipulate it, and then send it to the integration that you'll be sending it to. And then with the response of it, you can also transform it actually before returning it back to the client. So that's it for the REST API, both with the proxy integration on the previous video and now with the non-proxy integration. So you now have API gateways that invoke the Genesys Cloud API. So in the next video, I'll be showing how to use our Genesys tools like the Genesys Cloud CLI, the CXS code, and our SDKs to call the API gateway that invokes the Genesys Cloud API. So rather than our tools calling the Genesys Cloud API directly, there might be some cases that you want to call the API gateway that you created instead. So we'll be doing that in the next video.